hopping on early. Once again, good morning for some folks, good afternoon for others. To first round of sessions in today's digital conference for the Kateri Circles and Kateri Tekakwitha conference. We still have a few minutes, just a couple minutes until our official start time. So feel free to hang out while we wait for others to join. Okay, well, we are at the time at the beginning of our session, so really thank you to all of you who are here and logged on. Appreciate you coming. So I'll just go ahead and begin. And those who join will continue to pull in as we move along and move forward. So just to start with, I'll just say how midakiapi lemakakanaji machapalo. Hello, my name is Maka Black Elk. Greetings to all of you, to my relatives across this nation. I am from the Oglala Lakota community, the tribe in Pine Ridge, South Dakota. Though I am zooming to you today from the lands of the Potawatomi here in northern Indiana. My session today for the Kateri conference is to really sort of engage in a conversation about the work that Red Cloud is doing, the school I work for, and I'll talk more sort of about that, as well as sort of the greater implications for what it means for Indigenous Catholic people writ large. So thank you for coming, and hopefully you're at the right session. Just want to thank you for being here. I'm going to go ahead and just start actually in prayer, just because I think that's an important grounding as we start this conversation. And so you go ahead and join me in your own way by putting yourself into the arms of your Creator, and begin in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Gracious and glorious God, you choose imperfect people to do your work because that is all that there is. And we just ask, as we begin to grapple, as we strive and to do the difficult work, that you provide us with the courage, with the zeal, with the compassion, and most above all, with the love, to engage in difficult work, in difficult conversations, and in the difficult journey that we all face as we move closer and closer to you. We ask all this through your Son, Jesus. Amen. And the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. Thank you for just joining me in that quick prayer, because I do think it's important to ask God sometimes for courage when we engage in really difficult conversations. And that's essentially what the topic I bring to you today is and involves a lot of difficult conversations. So as I mentioned, my name is Maka Black Elk. I'm the Executive Director for Truth and Healing at Red Cloud Indian School. Red Cloud Indian School is a K-12 Catholic Jesuit-sponsored school on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. That is where I am from and where my community is from. I'm also a graduate of the school. And I think just to begin, I'm going to be sharing some slides that we'll kind of walk through and really focus on kind of this work that Red Cloud itself has begun, and then talk about, again, that greater implication for Indigenous Catholic identity as we move through this work ourselves and sort of the questions that we're discovering. I think to begin, just a little bit of history about Red Cloud. Red Cloud started as Holy Rosary Mission and was founded in 1888, but of course the relationship between the Jesuits and Lakota people begins even earlier than that. For many people, for many encounters early on in the Great Plains with Lakota people, the Jesuits were one of the more well-established, that early on, unlike a lot of other missionaries, of course, where the focus was solely sort of on conversion, for the Jesuits, there was also a bit of reciprocity and learning. And in fact, many of the early Jesuits became fluent in the Lakota language because of their continued sort of relationship building that was established. And in fact, because of that, the Black Robes, as the Lakota called them, the Catholic priests, were present at a lot of the major events and treaty signings because of the trust and sort of their ability to translate and sort of have that relationship being built and established. So early on, when it became clear that schools, these boarding schools, were going to be established from a federal level, that Chief Red Cloud, the now namesake of our school and one of the leaders of the Lakota, felt that it was really important that if we're going to have people come from white society in to found and run these schools, that at the very least establishing a partnership with people that they already knew was really important. And so that really came in the form of the Jesuits. And so the Jesuits were asked by Chief Red Cloud. He traveled to Washington to get permission for them to do so, because at that time the Catholics didn't have permission to establish schools everywhere. There was a limitation, certainly for a lot of Christian denominations, and sort of assignments being given out. But the Jesuits came regardless, even after the fact, and established this school. But of course, it's really important to note that even though this relationship began with this reciprocity, at the same time, there is still sort of underneath all of this a real desire for conversion, and maybe even more insidiously, a real desire for the change of culture, right, in a way that is not as mutual as we would hope it would be today. And so early on, of course, the nature and the flavor of the school matched the nature and the flavor of these schools nationwide, and of course, in similar patterns to our neighbors in the north in Canada, amongst the First Nations. And so these schools, of course, and these are all pictures from our records and from Holy Rosary Mission, these schools really started off as an assimilation method for a way for Indigenous children to come and sort of learn the language of English, for kids to come and learn the sort of skills of the modern trades, especially in this time of sort of pre-industrialization and early industrialization. And that was sort of deemed the necessary means of saving these communities. Yet that came, of course, with a lot of challenge of removal of children from family, from the first teachers, removal of language and the identification with that language, the knowledge of that language, and a real sense of cultural disconnect. And here we start to see some of the origins of some of the more difficult questions we face today, right? To what extent is our Indigenous culture, in my particular case, our Lakota culture, to what extent is that able to be recontextualized, able to be enculturated? To what extent is it viewed as valuable? And at this point in time, it's not viewed as very valuable, not viewed as really worth full access and full inquiry into that particular framework. At the time, of course, many Native parents didn't have a whole lot of choices on where they would send their children to school or whether they would at all. Especially in the late 1800s, early 1900s, the poverty on reservations was so incredibly high, the dependence on the US government was so incredibly high that rations were sort of the primary source of living for most Indigenous people on their reservations. And often it would come with a threat of the stopping of those rations if the children were not sent to these schools. But otherwise, in other ways, right, the poverty was so rampant that also, in fact, incentivized parents to send their children to these schools, because otherwise it was difficult to guarantee that their children would receive sort of the basic needs that some of these schools would also provide, even if they did so inadequately. And we know today that many of them were unable to provide them inadequately. The underfunding of these schools was extreme. The quote that I have here is actually from a graduate from one of our schools, from our school, who talked about this, who graduated in the 1950s, who said that this was really detrimental, the removal of them from their homes, that they lost that bonding to their parents. And that's probably the most important thing that was taken away. Losing a whole part of your culture, it leads to a loss of who you are. And she says, if you don't make that transition knowing who you are, I think you go around the rest of your life not knowing who you are. And this sort of begins, I think, a pattern of some of the ways in which boarding school survivors talk about that experience and the long-lasting impact of it, of being removed from family, removed from culture, and the way in which that can sort of alienate internally oneself from that greater sense of community. These schools in general were, as I mentioned, and this was included for Red Cloud, they were by and large fashioned not to necessarily produce children who would then go to college. They were more sort of inclined towards pushing them towards the trades. So boys were taught to do carpentry and smithing. Girls were taught yarning and sewing, domestic labor, so that they could do that in the home as well as perhaps provide those kinds of domestic services elsewhere. And over time, these schools would start to gain a reputation, certainly amongst at least stories passed on from family, and that's true even in my own family. I'm a product, and in fact, most Indigenous people don't have to look very far in their family tree to find that their ancestors were attendees of these schools, and that's true in my family, who ancestors on multiple sides both attended Holy Rosary Mission, which is now Red Cloud Indian School, the school I work at and I'm talking a bit about today, and also Carlisle Indian Industrial School, the most infamous of these schools and the first one in the United States, whose founder really coined that term, kill the Indian and save the man, as sort of the framework for what these schools set out to do. And they gained a reputation for abuse, for certainly trauma. And there is a complexity to the story as well, because they also were places of if not intentional, at the very least, indirect empowerment, where kids did find ways to sort of ascertain and identify who they were, find careers, and really out of these schools, the first several generations of educated Indigenous people come to the forefront who later become activists and change makers in their communities. So while these are definitely sources of trauma that have long-lasting impact, they're also sources of real change, sometimes in spite of the institution rather than because of. But I want to make sure that both of those stories are a part of this journey. These schools, of course, practice some of the things that we now know of today to be incredibly destructive for certainly cultures to continue to exist and thrive. The ones that are pointed out to most often are, of course, the loss of language, but also even just cultural identities, such as the loss of in our culture here in South Dakota, the cutting of hair. I have a quote from one of our alumni, one of our boarding school survivors who graduated in the 1940s, who talked about this, who talked about having long hair and then coming to the boarding school and having that shorn really short and feeling sort of a real almost disassociation as a result of it, where he said he found it very ironic that they told me one thing and then they showed us Christ on the cross who had long hair. And I just didn't understand. But back in those days, you don't ask questions. So even just the visual of seeing, wait a second, there's this person that they're asking us to really venerate who has long hair, but that is something I cannot have. And the real disconnect that sort of spoke to his young self at the time, and something that lasted with him for decades. So Holy Rosary Mission is certainly a legacy in my community. It continues to be a source of incredible tension for my community. And today, though we have students who are now maybe 2 generations removed from the boarding school experience, that story still resonates so strongly. And in fact, our students, even today, still are sort of begging for this history to be addressed, understood, and for them to be guided and helped in making sense of what that history means for them. So a few years ago, we embarked on this journey to start even understanding what truth and healing was and what it would mean for a school like ours that has this history to engage in a process that sought to address this history and potentially heal from it, knowing that it's going to be an incredibly difficult, incredibly long process. But in our work, in our year of sort of research, our year of learning, we started to recognize some really important steps in this process. And so I want to introduce those 4 steps that sort of we have used here at Red Cloud to guide the work moving forward. And we're at the very, very early stages, maybe even pre-stages of this work. But just to give a quick overview, this work of truth and healing and the guidance that we have comes to us from the scholarship of actually an Indigenous woman from our community, Dr. Marie Yellowhorse Braveheart, who is also a member of the Oglala Lakota tribe and who is from our same community, brought these 4 stages forward as she did her own research in talking with and engaging with those who held historical trauma. Those stages are as follows. The first is confrontation. And that stage is all about engaging in the truth. That's why truth and healing, in that phraseology, truth comes first. You have to begin with the understanding of that history. You have to begin with especially the stories of those who directly experienced it as much as possible. That it comes with their testimony, with the sharing of those stories that they've perhaps hidden, both good stories, but also especially their painful stories. it comes with the opening of our records. That is something that we are beginning to engage in terms of understanding how we best do that. What's the best way forward in terms of making our records accessible, especially to those family members whose stories it directly impacts. And those records are a part of that truth-telling process where we are confronting the past. So these 4 stages, again, and this was brought forward in the chat, come from Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart, and I can put that in the chat as well for folks. In the work that she's done, engaging with those who are sort of recovering from historic trauma. That second stage is the understanding stage. And that really is about taking that history that's now been brought forward, that's been put out for people to sort of digest and face, even the very difficult history that we've not been wanting to face, that we take the time to process that there's actual dialogue about that history, about those experiences, where there's time for whole communities to have the time and the resources and the support, spiritual support, mental health support, and the direct support to engage in even just making sense of what these stories mean for us today. And so it's a real sort of almost collective therapeutic process for a community to go through that comes after sort of we've brought these stories forward, after we've brought these records forward and sort of really digest and learn about them and what they mean. Only after these 2 stages happen is healing even possible. And what's most important about this stage of healing is that, again, it comes after 2 really difficult stages. Oftentimes we want to jump to healing right away, but really healing has to come much later in this process. And these are the things that have to happen before it. And really what we know about this healing stage isn't that we can determine what it looks like or who will even go through it. It really is directed by those, especially survivors who faced the harm most directly, but also their descendants and those who experienced that residual historic trauma, that it has to come from them, that they're the ones who need to name and identify that which will allow them to become closer to healed. And we don't ever think of healing as actually a single process, as a snapshot in time where then we can say that there's a before healing and an after healing, and that, you know, there's a very clear leap from one to the other. We know that healing is actually an iterative process, that it actually comes over and over again, that it actually needs to be revisited over and over again. And that in that sense, it's not a single process, and in fact has to be something that happens multiple times throughout time, and may not be something that ever finishes. But ultimately that does lead us to that 4th and final stage of transformation, where we are asked individually, as a community, and then as an institution, in the case of Red Cloud, this former boarding school, to be different from what we were before, that we can't go through a process like this and then return to the status quo and sort of behave the same way, be the same organization, that ultimately many things have to be transformed and changed. And again, we don't know what that looks like yet. So that's the process that we're following. And again, we're at the early stages of it. We're probably even in the pre-confrontation stage. So there's a lot to learn, a lot to unpack still, and a lot to do moving forward. And it will be an imperfect process, but one that we've sort of chosen to actively engage in. In the question in the chat box, there's a question, sort of, how do you differentiate the original agenda of cultural genocide that killed the Indian, save the man, with the identity of natives as Christians? How do we remove the association of Christianity as conformity or as the rejection of one's native culture? And so I'm glad you asked that question, Father Bailey, because it is part of the conversation that comes next after I've talked about the history of Red Cloud and the stages that we are going to be going through as we move forward in this work. This history of the boarding schools has writ a legacy within Indigenous communities across this country and even across our international boundaries to our neighbors in the north, that really tells a story about the relationship that Native people have with sort of their the bringing and the coming of Christianity and that overall story of colonization. That this is a really strong, almost integrated and intertwined part of that story, these schools and what they did and sort of how they did it. And that really entangles so much when it comes to identity, Christianity, spirituality, and Native culture and tradition, that there's so much entanglement of this in ways both positive and negative as a result of this. And it's very difficult to unpack. But what I would like to start with is that there's a lot of anger, certainly especially from the community of Indigenous peoples that are not Christian, and who in fact, because of that history, really foundationally distrust the Catholic Church and other Christian denominations, and that close association that they have with colonization and the ways in which Native peoples were forcefully made to change who they were. Ever since in the wake of Kamloops and Kawesos and the stories that have come out of Canada of the unmarked graves that have been found, there has been a real outcry from different pockets of Indigenous communities to deal with this and maybe even to start to reject Christianity as a whole. I'm going to pull in a few examples actually from my own social media. And social media isn't always the best place to sort of judge a movement, but I think at the very least, social media does inform us of sort of what the loudest voices are saying, and that's still a very consequential voice. And so the question that this has brought forward for us is Catholicism inherently colonial, right? As we move forward in our own work of grappling with our history, this question sort of starts to come out in different places as we ask ourselves, what does it mean to have been a school and a community that was, of course, brought into these systems, brought into these schools, and made to change in really direct and almost in these forceful ways, right? There's a very stark line you can draw between culture when it changes naturally out of just the meeting of different cultures and the sharing of cultures and as they change over time, versus something that's very much violently forced. And that's a hard line that we have to draw here in terms of how it comes about. But it often both happen in different ways. But what we can say is that this forced version of it was also clear here. And so we have to ask ourselves today, what does it mean to be a Catholic school serving in a community where there are Catholic Native people, but also where there are non-Catholic Native people who also participate in the school, and there's these residual tensions that exist between the Catholic faith and the Catholic Church and some of the broader Native community. So in social media since Kamloops, this question has come forth in different ways, and the loudest voices, right, have been really clear on their stance, where they say things like ban and remove all churches on our reservations, right? And these things are sort of widely shared, and where the feelings behind some of these posts are rooted in some real anger, and some of that anger really rooted in some truth. that we have to really grapple with. So this is just one example of that. Another example, right? Stop baptizing your Indigenous babies. They don't need it. Teach them their culture instead of religion. And people agreeing with that, right? So when these sort of messages start to come across and you start seeing them sort of shared across different sort of pockets of social media that, at least in my sphere of social media, right, there's a lot of Native people sort of sharing these and having the discussion out there. But there's some real challenges that brings for us as a school, still sort of reckoning with this history. And I bring it up to say there is real challenge in engaging with what it means, therefore, to be a Catholic institution serving an Indigenous community and making sense of where we go from here. And so I want to ground this discussion first in just a real fundamental truth. There is a pervasive nature of colonialism that we're still grappling with today. In fact, the very definition of being Indigenous is that you are a colonized people. The United Nations doesn't use an official definition for Indigenous peoples, but they often point to the sort of this one common definition of it that basically says that Indigenous peoples are a people who, having once been the dominant society, now are no longer the dominant society. And that could be, negative or positive, but regardless, it means that they are in the minority, that they are a culture that has sort of been superseded and sort of subverted in many ways by the new dominant culture. And it's that experience of colonization that really frames the Indigenous experience, as Linda Tekakwitha Smith, a Maori scholar, has said, that these are peoples whose nations and whose own histories were radically interrupted and radically reformulated by, in our case, European imperialism. And I think it's important to just name that this is the reality that Indigenous peoples sort of are living in the sense of, yes, we are a colonized people, both historically and today. And what does that mean for how we sort of engage in creating new society or sort of advancing our own society and communities further, given that particular history. And so in chat box, right, there's this question of how do those of us who are both Native and Catholic explain to our relatives that the abuse and trauma of residential schools and forced assimilation are not reflective of Jesus, separating the sins of those who come in the name of Christ from Christ himself? It's a great question. And I think what this does, this idea of this pervasive nature of colonialism does, is actually makes those things very hard to separate. And so let me explain what I mean by that. There's a binary effect that colonization has had on Indigenous peoples in the way that they think of themselves and the way that often the discussion around who they are today is. And what it does is it creates this very binary black and white way of framing, that there's an Indigenous sort of experience, way of knowing, way of being, way of understanding, and then there's this colonial understanding and world, and that these two things are often in the opposite of each other, and in fact they're in conflict with each other. So often you see these sort of play out in different ways in different parts of society, where Indigenous is described as traditional, but then the non-Indigenous is described as modern, savage versus civilized, tribal systems versus Western systems, the hyper-local versus the global, the legitimate versus the illegitimate. And in the case of spirituality, the pagan and the Christian. And that Native peoples are often forced, inherently or otherwise, sometimes explicitly, but often implicitly, forced to make choices between one of these two things. And often this has been sort of talked about even in a positive light, as Native peoples being people who have to walk in two worlds, Sometimes it's framed positively, that Native peoples are people who, take, many things from their traditions and combine them with many things from these new, even when you start to use the language, it starts to get really challenging, right? From Western traditions or from non-Indigenous traditions, and that they start to combine those things. And there's some truth to that, but what this walking into worlds framework does is it still sort of reinforces this idea that Native peoples are making these choices and that they only have these two choices. And that can be a real challenging thing for this dialogue. And in fact, speaking to that question earlier about how do we think about Christianity for Indigenous peoples as being something, again, forced and something that came violently versus the message of Christ himself and the faith that we know may not have actually wanted, or maybe certainly did not want those kinds of things to happen. So we have this binary effect that makes things really challenging. And this two world sort of narrative that makes things really challenging. And there's a number of assumptions that come in because of that. There are assumptions that come in with this kind of framework that make this conversation even harder. One is this idea that these cultures exhibit some kind of internal uniformity, that there's an easy way to recognize, oh, this is what Indigenous culture is, and then this is what non-Indigenous culture is. And we can name them and they're static, as opposed to actually both things being, both cultures, both areas being actually quite frenetic, moving and changing all the time, and that there's diversity within those cultures, that there's disagreement among Indigenous peoples about their own cultures and about their own beliefs and opinions. So there is no internal uniformity. These things are actually quite, there's a spectrum that exists within. That everyone means the same thing when we talk about Indigenous peoples walking in two worlds. And we don't always know if that's the case. That when someone talks about Native peoples walking in two worlds, what do they mean by that? It could mean many things. It could mean people, again, choosing traditions and choosing to still be sort of modern, but those come with so many different ideas that it's hard to really sort of name what we mean by them. But it sort of tries to simplify when something this big is really not easy to simplify. Because it's this idea that there's these two distinct cultural worlds that can be merged. And again, that is not necessarily what's happening here. In fact, there are really Native peoples, Indigenous peoples exist in one world that's actually really complicated, that comes with traditions that have been kept, that has come with changes that have been adopted, have been forced, but nonetheless have now become the norm, and new choices that are happening all the time, new choices that are changing culture at an individual level and at a sort of macro level. So there really is no sort of sense of we're merging two distinct things. There's actually just really one existence that we're in that is constantly evolving. And we have to find ways to sort of make sense of that. And that can come down to this idea that, right, that people can pursue the best of both worlds. But what do we mean by best? That can be a very subjective thing. And then the bigger question, that institutions can help mediate between these two worlds. Institutions like schools. I work in a school system. Schools are more and more becoming the place where culture, it's felt like schools are becoming the place of burden, where culture and spirituality are supposed to be passed on, and less is coming from different sources. But schools are having greater pressure to do that. But that other institutions, churches, where we work, that these places can sort of help us mediate between these two worlds. And again, we're problematizing whether or not even two worlds totally exist in the way that we're thinking about them amongst these assumptions. And the question that comes in a chat to us is, do natives see Jesus Christ as a white man? Would there be a need for a distinction between the religion and Jesus as God, the man who founded the church, which may or may not be what he wants it to be? And perhaps that this understanding phase needs to sort of search for whether Jesus is the true and real part of that, rather than sort of this religious or cultural identity choice. I think that's part of this really important conversation. One of the ways in which we're starting to think about this at Red Cloud is, roughly 20 to 25% of our students are Catholic. The rest of them are not. Now, sometimes the big assumption, and this comes from this two-world thinking, sometimes the assumption is, well, if a student isn't Catholic, then they must be traditional. And that's not true either. We do have a number of students who would identify themselves as sort of from the spiritual traditions of the Lakota, that's what they practice and that's what their identity is. But like teenagers across the world, many students are still questioning whether or not they even believe in a creator. Now, they're much more likely to be respectful and participate in Lakota tradition and spirituality and ceremony, even if they don't necessarily at the end of the day believe in a creator, believe in a God, or believe in the God, right? Believe in the God that both traditions profess to believe in. But they'll still participate because it's sort of seen as a form of cultural respect to do so. But really, we have to ask ourselves now as an institution, we have students who are Catholic, we have students who are not. Some of our students are even, in fact, very antagonistic and angry at the presence of the Catholic faith in the school. And even though they're coming in knowing that it's sort of present and knowing that it's a part of the school's identity. But over the years, right, we have sort of, as an institution, as a school, shied away from talking about this very difficult reality. And we've been sort of pushed through this process that we're engaging in now to ask ourselves, how do we make sense of this history when we talk about being a Catholic school and a Lakota school? How do we make sense of that? What does it mean in terms of how we talk about Jesus Christ himself? How do we talk about this faith and the history of this church, especially as it relates to Native people? That these are really difficult questions. And right now, some of the early things we're coming to, and we're very at the early stages of this, is that we actually have to be quite honest about that history. That students come in with an inherent sense of knowing the way that Christianity came to this country, the way that Christianity came to this community, is a grander narrative of violence that is very hard to untangle that from. They know that coming in. They have a sense of that coming in from their families, from their own sense of Native history. And we're, as a school, being quite silent about it. And that's very obvious to them, to the students who sort of know that, this difficult question isn't being answered. So the first and foremost thing that we've sort of are thinking about is, how do we tell a realistic history of the church and how Catholicism came to this community, and the ways in which that Catholicism, that version of it, the people who practiced it, came with many of them good intentions, but that the impact was nonetheless detrimental. That we talk about that history very authentically, and very much in the wholeness that we can try to bring it from, especially again, from the perspective of survivors who experienced that. And then, and only then, can we start to make the distinction between that history and the faith of Christ himself, the message that Christ brought in the Gospels, one that we know is one of love, one that would never have approved of the way in which those early means of bringing the message here was done, and start to understand that there's another version of this church that is one of liberation, one of justice, and that we can see that exemplified in other communities that have done this. You know, we've talked about turning to the example of the African American community in the United States, who were also a community who experienced deep mistreatment and dehumanization at the hands of people who claimed to be Christian, and who also then took up that mantle to say, well, we're going to take this faith and we're going to actually make it real and walk forward with the message that we think this faith was actually speaking to, one of true sort of humanity and love, and a belief that we are all made in the image and likeness of God, that we can turn to other places across the world where Christianity has been a force of liberation for people who have been oppressed. But we have to be able to see that both of those things have been true at the same time in history, and really try to make sense of what we aspire our faith to be. And that sometimes we as humans who are imperfect people, because that's all there are only imperfect people, that we get it wrong often. So we're trying to make sense of how we do that, right? How do we move forward, really grappling with that true history and still trying to send a message of what we aspire this faith to be, knowing that we have got it, as human beings, have not always gotten that done, have not done that correctly, or with the message that we would hope to send. And so the impacts of that binary framework are that, you know, we can really have challenges with and resistance to change. And it makes a lot of sense that Indigenous peoples are trying to save something that they have felt has been attacked. And that can make it really difficult to continue the process of just natural cultural change that we're going through. We do it anyway, but sometimes there's still that resistance because of that very real need to protect. But unfortunately, that brings up questions of authenticity. Who is authentically Native? Are Indigenous peoples who have become Catholic no longer authentically Native? Have they somehow betrayed their identity? I think we know the answer is no, but this binary problem sort of brings that forward and again pushes people to try and make a choice. And of course, it's that struggle with identity that I've talked about also. And so really this brings up, what does it mean for the Catholic Church and Indigenous communities? You know, there have been calls for apology from different pockets of Indigenous communities, from the Pope and from the Church in general. The problem with apologies is that, one, as soon as they're uttered, they're only heard by the people who heard it, and then no one else who's heard it is impacted by it. And so apologies quickly die as soon as they've been uttered for the people who have not heard that apology. It's also the easiest thing that could be done. That doesn't mean that the church shouldn't do it. I think they should. But it is the easiest thing that can be done. The more difficult work is that confrontation, is that understanding, and all of the things that come with it. The nature of the binary on Native Christianity is really important to think about and think about how we do this moving forward. That binary often forces people to sort of feel like they have a choice to make, that they can either be Native or they can either be Christian, but they can't be both. And we have to grapple with that in terms of how we make sense of that and how we start to dismantle that, because it's not true. It's not true that people have to reject their Native identity to be Christian. And that brings us to bigger questions for the church itself, questions of recontextualization and enculturation. What does the Catholic Church need to do to be better about how it thinks about how it approaches and how it integrates Native people into the faith writ large? Native peoples can often tell stories about wanting to bring some of their culture into the church and facing resistance from from priests who really don't know how to do that, or who don't have the skill set or knowledge, or who still have real bias against Indigenous customs and traditions because of that historic negativity toward it. And these are the questions that we're starting to grapple with, and there's no real answers for. I want to give us time to have just an open-ended discussion for people, even if they would like to hop on, turn on their mics and even just talk openly. So that really sort of is the end of my sort of formal talks. So I'm going to stop sharing, and I would just really be interested in hearing from people who are here, sort of what their questions, concerns, and thoughts are on this process, and kind of what I've put forward so far with what we're doing here at Red Cloud and the questions that that's brought up for us. But thank you all for at least listening to all of that, and for entertaining my non-expert thoughts on the work that we're doing. I'll just actually quickly, Michelle in the chat said, I've heard other natives say they can't understand how natives can kneel to a god that would allow the assimilation attempt, and horror stories of the boarding schools. They would think that the religious were acting on orders from God, living their faith. They don't understand the concept of sinful religious. Native spiritual people who don't follow the ethics and morals of the tribe wouldn't be shunned, not followed in a very immediate way. They wouldn't be recognized. Yeah, and I think that, again, that absolutely speaks to one of the things that is so challenging about this, the conversation since Kamloops and the other stories out of Canada, is that it's really easy to take this story and turn it into a story of Native peoples versus the Catholic Church, when there's actually an intra-community conversation here of Native peoples who are not Christian and Native peoples who are, and the real conversation that needs to happen there, the dialogue needs to happen there, and a dialogue that often really doesn't want to be had amongst Native peoples, because it brings up really difficult questions about identity and about authenticity. But that's really important that we remember that this is also an internal dialogue for Native people to have. I think I hear someone's mic on, so I'm sorry for that.
I was just going to make a comment about that. You know, it is definitely something that I myself personally have struggled with, is the idea of what my Christian faith is versus my traditional spirituality. And so I look at the word of spirituality and religion first to know that there's definitely a difference. So as a spiritual person, and I look at people like Maka Black Elk, who has been brought up and is in a way that we'd like to identify him to the Catholic Church as a saint and have the church acknowledge him that way. I have to look at his own spirituality and how he came to terms with Catholicism and what that means, as well as his own traditional spirituality, because we look at him as the epitome of a man who knew traditional spirituality to the extent of being that healer, a person who had visions and could act on those visions and brought about healing among the people. And we're not just thinking like emotional healing, but we're talking about actual physical healing of illnesses and sicknesses. And knowing that Jesus too was a person who was a healer in the world. So I have to examine the idea of Jesus and who he identifies and how I identify him myself personally. And that kind of helps me to reconcile these things, to know that I have a spirituality that really is connected to the person of Jesus, and how do I know him and who he is. And I have to eliminate all of my Catholic teachings to be able to really understand Jesus, because I think Catholicism itself has skewed him a little bit, and the language is strictly outside of my own culture. So I know that my perspective is from a cultural perspective, and so I try to bring Jesus into that. And I wonder if this is how Maka Black Elk came to terms with the idea of being Native and Catholic, to understand the person of Jesus and what Jesus was for him. Of course, Nicholas not being here can't answer those questions, but in my own imagining, I think of that sort of a situation where Maka Black Elk knew the person of Jesus personally, so he could embrace Catholicism because that's how he learned about Jesus. The same with many of our ancestral teachings. Our teachers who were catechists, Pete Ketchus was one, my own grandfather was a catechist, trying to understand how they could be a catechist and how they taught about what was expected from a Christian follower. And so I continue to develop those ideas in my own head to try to know what Nicholas was thinking, what Pete was thinking, and these being our relatives, how did they come to resolve those issues for themselves?
No, thank you for sharing that, Angie. I think one of the things that has been really helpful, what that brings up for me, and something that's been helpful for me in thinking about all of this, is that we can recognize a history where even in Jesus's time, right, the Pharisees, the sort of very highly religious, if we're going to use that term, right, came with this perspective of, you have to believe like I do and behave like I do, and then if those things are true, then you belong. And that Jesus was quite the opposite, that he started with, you belong, and then believe in me, and then we can talk about behavior. But that the first thing that was truth was that you belong. I'm sometimes asked, and Angie, you and I talked about this, right? That people ask, like, as a Native person, how can you be Catholic given that history, right? And I think it's a fair question. I think it's a question that shouldn't be just limited to Indigenous peoples or African Americans. I think it should be a question that we're all asked, and that we all sort of come to recognize that what happened in the boarding school history was similar to what happened with the Pharisees in Jesus' time. There was a sense of, you have to behave like we do, you have to believe like we do, and then you belong, as opposed to what Jesus really brought, which was, you belong already, and then how do you take that to then learn to believe in me, and how do you keep becoming the person that you aspire to be? The great African-American theologian Howard Marshall wrote in his book Jesus and the Disinherited. He wrote that book because someone asked him the same question: how can you be a part of this church and this faith given what they've done to your people? And so he wrote this book, Jesus and the Disinherited. And then there he tells the story of Jesus. He retells the story of Jesus approaching the woman who is going to be stoned to death, and we know the story of how he then tells the men who are accusing her about their own sins and how they one by one walk away. But he tells this beautiful story. He retells the story, and he talks about this moment that this is where Jesus sort of demonstrates something really beautiful and profound, where he approaches that woman and that he places this crown above her head, and that for the rest of her life, she's going to try to live to be tall enough to wear that crown, and that he does this for all of us. And I think that that's again a beautiful reminder of we are all called to enculturation. Sometimes that conversation is that it's people who are coming from cultures that aren't necessarily haven't known Christianity and Catholicism as long as another culture has, that they have to do this work to enculturate and bring their culture sort of closer to the faith. I think we need to ask that of everyone, and that's another example of that, that we all have to recognize that what happened in those boarding schools was not something that actually our faith would have called us truly to do. And yeah, that's what helps me sort of try and make sense of this history and make sense of why I'm still Catholic today and why I still feel strongly about that. Whereas I can still hold my Native identity and my Native culture in full tact. So thank you, Angie, for that. We have like a few minutes left. So I don't know if we have time to take any more additional questions or thoughts, but I would just offer in conclusion of this conversation, one, that this isn't a conversation that we truly can conclude. I think these conversations have to go on and on into other spaces amongst all Indigenous peoples and those serving in Indigenous communities in Catholic ministry, that we have to be not afraid of those conversations. The last thing I would just give is we're here at Red Cloud amongst our parishes, amongst our churches, thinking about, how can we survey our community to get a better sense of what this looks like for Catholic Native people and those who work with them. So in the chat, I'm going to be dropping 2 links. This is just for you to sort of, one, look at and see what some of these questions are asking, and 2, maybe even take some of these questions and adapt them to your own context. But the first link that I'm going to drop is a link to a survey that would be for Indigenous Catholics. So if you are an Indigenous person and you identify as Indigenous and you identify as Catholic, then this first link, that survey is for you. And I'll just make note of that, right? This is the survey for Indigenous Catholics survey. And then I'm gonna drop a second link if you're someone who is not Indigenous, but you still work in ministry to Native people or a Native context, that this survey is for you. And it's just, a lot of these are the same questions, but they're just adapted for those different communities. And again, I'd be interested in your answers. I would get the results if you took it. But really, I don't send it to you to have you take it, but I send it to you as a way of offering those questions to you for deeper thought and reflection. And so that second link is ministers in Native Catholic communities. And that's it. Thank you for everyone who came and who were a part of this conversation.